This past Halloween, I decided to keep things low-key. I'd stocked up on candy and figured I'd just spend the night handing it out. Maybe catch up on some classic horror movies between visitors. Halloween's always a fun night in my neighborhood, with kids of all ages running around in costumes, parents tagging along, and the kind of buzz in the air that only comes once a year. The first few hours went by without a hitch. By around 9:30, though, the crowds had mostly thinned out. I was about to settle into the couch when the doorbell rang again. I grabbed the candy bowl, expecting a couple of older kids trying to score some last-minute treats. But when I opened the door, there was just one person standing there. A man, tall and thin, with his face painted in a garish skull design. His costume was simple, just dark clothes, but the paint was so detailed, it was almost unsettling. I forced a friendly smile and held out the bowl, saying, "Take as much as you want. You're probably my last visitor for the night." He didn't move. He just stared at me, his painted face expressionless, almost as if he were waiting for something. Finally, he reached into the bowl, taking a single piece of candy, his hand lingering just a second too long. Then he turned and walked down my porch steps without a word. Odd, but Halloween attracts all types, right? I shook it off and went back to my movie. But about 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. I opened the door, and there he was. The same man, same skull-painted face, standing there silently. Now, I was starting to feel uneasy. I tried to keep it light, saying something like, "Back for seconds, huh?" He just tilted his head, watching me with those dark, unblinking eyes. Trying to stay calm, I held out the candy bowl again, hoping he'd just take something and leave. This time, he didn't reach for the candy. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, the silence stretching on far longer than felt comfortable. Finally, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I closed the door, locking it this time, and went back inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But I couldn't relax. Every few minutes, I'd glance at the front window, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. I kept telling myself he was probably just some guy messing around, trying to be spooky for Halloween. But then, the doorbell rang again. My heart sank. I walked slowly to the door, and sure enough, through the peephole, I saw him, standing there, perfectly still, like he'd been waiting all night. This time, I didn't open the door. I just watched, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't move. He just kept standing there, staring at the door like he knew I was on the other side. After a few minutes, he walked off the porch, but he didn't leave. Instead, he moved around the side of the house, disappearing from view. I felt a chill run down my spine. I locked all the doors and windows, my mind racing. I kept telling myself it was just a prank, someone going a little too far for Halloween. But when I heard the faint sound of scratching at the back door, I knew this was more than just a prank. I called out, hoping he'd hear me and realize he'd crossed a line. But the scratching only got louder, more deliberate. My heart was pounding, and I dialed 911, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, hoping they'd send someone over quickly. The operator stayed on the line with me, reassuring me that help was on the way. I stayed in the living room, my eyes fixed on the back door, listening to the scratching turn into a slow, deliberate tapping. Then, Just as the sound stopped, I heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper, coming from just outside. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was him. The flashing red and blue lights appeared just as I heard footsteps moving away from the house. By the time the police arrived and searched the property, he was gone, leaving no trace behind. They assured me they'd keep an eye on the area, but as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I'd spent Halloween nights alone before, without a second thought. But this time was different. I knew he was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. And every time I hear a knock at the door now, I can't help but wonder if it's him, coming back for one last visit. Last Halloween, I decided to stay in, hand out candy, and avoid the busy nightlife. My neighborhood goes all out on Halloween, and it's usually a steady stream of kids in costumes, parents in tow, and an overall festive vibe. I thought it'd be fun to enjoy the night from my porch, watching the costumes and decorations without having to leave home. The first couple of hours were exactly as I'd expected. Cute kids, funny costumes, the usual trick-or-treat, and laughter that fills the air every Halloween. But by 10 p.m., the crowds had mostly thinned out, and I was about to turn off the porch light when the doorbell rang. I figured it was some older kids squeezing in a last round of trick-or-treating. I opened the door, and there he was. A man, tall and gangly, standing alone on my porch. He was wearing an old-fashioned clown costume, faded and tattered, with a painted white face and a smeared red smile that stretched just a bit too wide. His eyes were dark, almost like he was looking through me, and something about him felt wrong. Not in a cheesy Halloween costume way, but unsettlingly real. I forced a polite smile and held out the bowl. "Happy Halloween. Help yourself." He didn't move, just kept staring, unblinking. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. "Hey, you're my last trick-or-treater for the night. Take as much as you want." Finally, without breaking eye contact, he reached into the bowl, took a single piece of candy, and held it in his hand, staring down at it like he'd never seen a piece of candy before. Then he looked back up at me, gave a slow, deliberate smile that made my skin crawl, and walked off into the shadows without a word. I closed the door, feeling strangely unsettled, and locked it. I tried to shake it off as just a weird Halloween encounter, but I couldn't quite get the image of his smile out of my head. I double-checked the locks and returned to the living room, convincing myself I was overreacting. About 15 minutes later, there was another knock at the door. It was a heavy, slow knock. 3 knocks, spaced just a bit too far apart. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't want to open it, but part of me felt like I needed to check. I peered through the peephole, and there he was, the same clown, just standing there, staring at the door with that eerie, too wide smile. I didn't open it. I watched him through the peephole, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't move. He just kept standing there, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned down out of sight. I heard a faint scratching at the bottom of the door, like he was dragging his fingers along the wood, slow and deliberate. I backed away, my heart pounding, unsure of what to do. After a minute, the scratching stopped, and I dared to look through the peephole again. He was gone. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a prank, someone trying to get a scare. But then I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the living room window. My stomach dropped. I knew I shouldn't look, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved slowly, trying to keep out of sight, and peeked around the corner. He was standing right outside the window, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the room as if he knew I was watching. He raised a hand and waved slowly, the smeared red of his painted smile twisting into a leer. Then he started tapping on the glass with his fingertips, soft but insistent, as if he were trying to lure me closer. That's when I decided to call the police. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial, but I managed to get through, whispering that there was a man outside my house, watching me. They said they'd send someone over right away and told me to stay on the line. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on the glass. But by the time I reached the other side of the room, he was gone. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, glancing out the windows, waiting for the police. When the flashing lights finally appeared outside, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as the officers searched the yard and the area around my house, they found no one, no footprints, no sign of the man in the clown costume. The officers assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night, and they suggested I keep my lights off and stay inside. As they were leaving, one of them noticed something by the front door. There, on the welcome mat, was the single piece of candy he'd taken, placed carefully in the center, as if it were some kind of message. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I haven't felt safe in my own home since. Every Halloween, I can't help but feel a chill when the sun goes down, waiting, wondering if he'll come back. That awful, painted smile lurking just outside my door, ready to remind me he's still out there, waiting for the next knock. When I was around 15, I decided I was too old to go trick-or-treating. I'd been out every Halloween up until then, but that year, I figured I'd just stay home and hand out candy. My parents were out at a Halloween party, so I had the house to myself, which sounded like a pretty good setup. A bunch of candy, a couple of scary movies, and the whole night to myself. I settled into the living room with a big bowl of candy, and at first, it was just what I'd expected. Kids came in waves. Ghosts, vampires, a few superheroes. I handed out candy, complimented costumes, and enjoyed the Halloween buzz from the comfort of my own house. Between groups, I'd watch a bit of the horror movie marathon I had going on, savoring my little grown-up Halloween. Then, around 9:30, things started to quiet down. Most kids were done trick-or-treating by then, so I figured I'd have the rest of the night to myself. I turned down the lights a bit, making it spookier while I watched my movie. Not even 10 minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me, since it had been dead silent for a while. Figuring it was just some late trick-or-treaters, I grabbed the bowl of candy and opened the door. But there was no one there. I looked up and down the street, but it was empty, the only sound coming from the leaves rustling in the wind. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe some kids were messing with me. I shut the door, locked it, and went back to the couch. A few minutes later, there was another knock, this time louder, almost like someone was banging on the door. I jumped, but I didn't open it right away. watched the door for a second, waiting to see if I could hear any voices or footsteps, but it was completely silent. Slowly, I made my way to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Just my empty porch, dimly lit by the Halloween decorations we'd put up. This time, I was definitely weirded out, so I locked the door again and went back to the couch, feeling uneasy. I tried to focus on my movie, but every little creak and groan the house made seemed louder. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back door. I froze. The back door was in the kitchen, and we didn't have a porch light back there, so it was pitch black. I muted the TV and listened, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or something brushing against the house. But the scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was tracing their nails along the glass. Taking a deep breath, I crept toward the kitchen. I didn't want to turn on the light and give myself away, so I stood there in the darkness, straining to hear. The scratching had stopped, but as I got closer, I heard a faint, almost whispering sound, like someone murmuring just outside the door. My heart was racing, and I felt this overwhelming urge to run, but I had to know what was out there. Summoning up whatever courage I had left, I flicked on the kitchen light and looked through the back door window. Nothing. The yard was empty, and the gate was shut. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Halloween, right? It had to be my imagination. I locked the back door for good measure and went back to the living room, still feeling a little shaken. Just as I was about to unpause my movie, the doorbell rang. This time, it was relentless, the chime echoing through the house, over and over. I stood there, frozen, not sure whether to open it or ignore it. But the ringing kept going, faster and louder, until it felt like it was going to drive me crazy. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call my parents, or maybe one of my friends. But when I looked at the screen, I noticed I had no signal, not even Wi-Fi. That was impossible. I'd been using it all night. Now, I was freaked out. I cautiously approached the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the lock. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and flung it open. But again, nothing. The street was empty, eerily silent, and the only thing on my porch was the bowl of candy, now looking sad and untouched. I quickly closed the door, locked it, and turned off all the lights. I figured if someone was messing with me, maybe they'd leave if they thought I wasn't home. I sat in the darkness, staring at the screen of my phone, willing it to come back to life. And then, just when I thought it was over, I heard a whisper. This time, it was coming from inside the house, so quiet it was almost inaudible. My skin prickled, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was coming from the hallway, just beyond the living room, and it was saying my name. I bolted. I didn't care what was going on or who it was. I grabbed my keys and ran out the front door, not stopping until I was at my neighbor's house across the street. They must have seen the look on my face, because they didn't ask questions. Just let me in and called my parents for me. When my parents got home, they tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just some pranksters, or maybe my imagination. But I knew what I'd heard. The whisper, the scratching, the feeling that someone, something, was watching me. That was the last time I stayed home alone on Halloween. And to this day, I still don't know if it was just a prank, or or if something far stranger was at play that night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget